Yeah, absolutely. So I think largely that perception was grounded in my own family's experience with having relatives in care homes, the difficulty in finding time to be with them, whether for myself or for other extended family. And I think more broadly, being aware of the context of a lot of care homes. I mean, again, coming from the United States, so that's a very particular perspective, but of people feeling very isolated, of the staffing quality and understaffing being really large issues, as well as forms of affordability and whatnot. And so I think generally there's a pretty negative, perception of care homes from where I'm coming from. So I think that sort of grounded that initial response.
Sure. So you said the isolation from the staffing. Is there anything about like the physical infrastructure of the building that made it feel more isolated, in particular?
Yeah, I speaking to one particular one that I remember, the building was itself very old, which doesn't inherently have to be a problem, but the way that it was structured, people were really sort of segmented in their own area. There wasn't a lot of communal space to interact. And the building itself didn't really facilitate sort of openness or interaction with other people. And so it did feel sort of like a very closed down, almost like cubicle office space, than something that was good for people and their ability to communicate with others.
Oh, I have quite a lot to say, sorry. So my grandmother was in care and I was responsible for her. And I'm not sure that isolation was what a lot of the people that I met struggled with. I think it was this feeling of incarceration. And I think both Zach and Andrew have kind of touched on that there's a sense that everything, all their requirements, all their needs are met within that particular space. And therefore that person has to justify making alternative choices. And I appreciate that there's a whole load of insurance stuff that, dealing with older people who are under your care, leaving the premises. But it just seemed to me that wherever I put my grandmother, the level of care was superb, but the amenities were just really poor and lazily thought out. And in fact, they are amenities that I think meet a lot of people's needs that don't cost money. Not everybody wants to dance and have young people jump up and down in front of them. I mean, I don't know if it's Cicero or some other random Greek bloke who said that, happiness comes when you have two key things. You have a garden and you have a library. Well, I've never been to an old people's home, and I have seen many where there is that space. There's sort of this sense of infantilizing old people, and they are quite, when they get older, they get, their characteristics are amplified. They're generally cantankerous. They don't necessarily want to socialize with other people, and this kind of forced infantilizing of groups of older people to do certain activities is just quite frankly annoying. And the best care home that I had for my grandmother, and she went through a series, was one where there were open spaces, there was light in the care homes. So it wasn't necessarily the actual space that was allocated to her, but the sense that she had choices to undertake activities according to her own timetable and her own abilities. And I just, I think that's the thing that terrifies me. So I'm not a young person, I'm about 200. So thinking, what do I do in like 30, 40 years time? Will there be a space where people have thought about, what I might want to do, how I might want to spend my time, rather than this kind of, it's the infanticizing that I think really got my grandmother down. Really clever woman. And yet there was nothing on an intellectual level. I mean, not a single book. I have never seen a single book in a public space for older people. How much can that really cost? And, if there are books, they do not have to be Mills and Boon,
Yeah, I just kind of wanted to second some of those themes that were brought up. I think for me, kind of personally thinking about a care home with my own experiences, it is that concept of choice and autonomy. And I think obviously it's difficult within the infrastructure of a care home, that it might be quite limited just because of the space you have. But that kind of feeling of seeing how my grandma, the space that was allocated to her, how much day-to-day choice she was able to make of what she was able to do. And obviously, again, as Fiona mentioned, there's some restrictions on that. depending on the person's needs. But yeah, definitely choice and autonomy are two themes that come to mind when I think about my future and a care home.
Sure. Yeah. So I think one thing too that Fiona had touched upon in her initial comment as well that really struck me and resonated was the sense of carcerality and avoiding this dynamic where you feel as though you are entrapped without choice in different respects, but also how much the physical environment shapes your interaction with others, but your sense of self, your sense of your own autonomy and agency. So I think that is really crucial in avoiding, I guess, I'm not a design expert in any respect, so avoiding these redundancies that can become sort of feelings of carcerality, I think are really crucial. And I think it's also important, not only sort of the type of care home in terms of who it's catering towards, but also the context in which it's built. So urban, centers are going to look different than ones that are rooted in more of a rural, rustic, suburban setting. And so one of my grandmothers was in a care home in North Carolina, and actually I probably spoke too broadly. That was a much more positive experience for a lot of the reasons we've identified, because they had a much greater sense of their own autonomy, but also it was interconnected with the environment surrounding it. So they had access to brilliant gardens and woods around it, and it was very open inside as well, with lots of natural light. And then the one for my other grandma was in New York City, which is a very dense city, and the care homes there were incredibly expensive. So the ones that she was able to move into, not only in terms of the services based off of affordability, but the design of it was, again, old, really dark, and very segmented. So I think the urban, non-urban dynamics, I think have a huge impact. But I think even within urban settings, there's so much that can be done to incorporate sort of natural environments, and sort of as Lydia was touching upon, access to other amenities, the city, et cetera. So I think both of those aspects are really important.
Something I really like that you just talked about as well is making the spaces useful and integrating the purpose, adding purpose for people that live there to be able to participate in their space.
I also know that you're talking about the structures of these organisations, but there have been not so much during the pandemic, but before the pandemic, there were some various experimental programmes that were starting up in the UK, where people in care homes were teaching young people in primary school to read. And at that point, once you have a use within the community, then you have a purpose you have a purpose to live, and it's not just about being visited by family, but actually you have a role in society, and I think that's really, really important.
Absolutely. We found that in our research we did last term. We found that integrating older generations with younger generations specifically was extremely helpful in mental health.
From my granddad, I think he would definitely prioritize community. I don't know if he'd prioritize it, but definitely community is really important to him. He's looked in, he's very independent, which we're really lucky, and he's looked into going into care homes, and fortunately he doesn't need daily care. He would just be, I actually don't know where he would need one at the moment, but the reason he doesn't want to leave where he lives now is because it's basically just a street of people his age, and I think he really, really values the community there. So he has looked into a few flats. I think it's not care homes as much as it's one of the ones where you can buy in extra services as and when you need them, that sort of structure. And the reason he hasn't done that is because his neighbour next door, for example, is of a similar age to him, and I feel they and everyone in the street, they just really look out for each other. So he's worried that if he goes into a care facility or whatever, he would be completely losing that and doesn't know if there would be the same sense of community as what he's got just living on his own.
Yeah, I'm just gonna sort of completely agree with that. It's sort of having the autonomy to go and choose when you want to be community based or when you want to do things on your own, and having the ability to do both and never being forced to do either. So my grandparents both very much like they don't want to go to a care home, and one of the things they don't want is both sort of the community that they'd lose outside. They don't want to have to, suddenly find a new community inside, but also just they like it sort of also feeds into the feeling useful. Like as soon as they feel like as soon as they go into a care home, they'll stop doing half the things that they go over. And like my gran until recently was going over the road and caring for a neighbour who was another 10 years older than her, so she was very much still feeling useful, and at the point where she was like she doesn't want to go into a care home because she feels like she wouldn't be doing as much, so they're sort of trying to find as many ways to sort of almost stay out of the care home, just because they feel like they'd lose that and the ability to just go for a walk around the block, go and meet their neighbours, go to whatever, but also have the ability just to go to the library or go to their own garden and things.
One thing that my grandmother really struggled with was and I'm not sure this is something that you can necessarily facilitate with the building itself, but this idea that they're very regimented according to, staffing needs. So, the time of lunch, the time of dinner, bedtime, cocoa time. I mean, it was just ridiculous that a grown adult woman couldn't choose when she went to bed and if she wanted to go out in the garden at night, and why are those choices removed? And a lot of it seemed a bit arbitrary to me. This is actually at Fairfield, where she was very capable and very mobile and intellectually curious still. And when those choices are removed, then that's when they become more childlike, because somebody else makes those decisions. So if you can have a building that allows free movement around, then I think that would make for happier residents.
Yeah, I would also say, and I again, not having the knowledge about this per se, but I think the design of the building, whether it's like square, circular, other shapes in between, I think can actually have an impact on what's sort of considered central, what's more peripheral in terms of people's access and where they're located within the building as well. So where is, the dining hall or the movie room or the library or the garden relative to where you're living? And where maybe if it is a longer term care facility where there are a greater number of staff members, where are they located in sort of in the context of everyone else's rooms? And so that was just something that came to mind. I don't have a particular experience with this per se, but I think that from trying to think about the infrastructure and architectural design, I can imagine the shape and location of these different aspects influence sort of what influences your agency and autonomy versus where your community spaces are.
I do, for all obvious reasons, and we all age and this is all going to be us eventually, but I don't think it's too late to have people that are using care facilities now to still be in the conversation. I think that definitely needs to be maybe more research that can happen, and I think obviously it's one thing looking to the future, but what is it that you can, small things, so can organisations like Castleoak help in care homes that have poorly laid out gardens this is a year, this could make the experience of people that are in care homes now better within a year's time frame. So I think yes, young people, it is very important, and because we're all going to age obviously, but I think that people living in care facilities now need to be central to the conversation too.
I definitely don't think it's this too young an age to involve people. In fact, if people haven't got an experience in care homes, it's almost, it's good to have their voices as well. If you find someone who has never visited a relative in a care home, so that they've got a completely fresh outlook of what they would want when they were older, without having ever seen their grandparents and how they live. And I do think that. So my great-grandparents never had a computer with the internet, for example. My gran is now at the stage where she can just about use Skype or Zoom or something. And just things like that, they're generational things of what you would want. So For example, most care homes still that I've been to have never had. I wouldn't want to bank of desks, but I've never had like an interactive suite where you could do FaceTime, for example, on a large screen. Which, I mean, particularly post-pandemic, we found that it's never too late for them to learn these sorts of abilities. Like, I didn't think before the pandemic, I thought my grandparents would never manage video call. Didn't think they'd hardly manage normal call. So like I've been talking to people who, but these are now very day to day for us, and in 50 years time there'll be some new technology that we'll be the rubbish ones with, and they'll be like, oh, we should start having care homes with virtual reality and holograms, and I don't know. So it's very important to have the next generation in the conversation.
I don't really think that I think if you have a space that fulfills the needs of a young person, the chances are they'll fulfill the needs of an old person, as long as you take into account, failing health and mobility issues. But from an intellectual point of view, people don't change their characters from when they're young to when they're really old. They might become more cemented. So I think it is really, really important to take the views of young people. I also think that young people have an energy and creativity to come up with the ideas that, even my generation, and I'm a lot older than the people on this call, would have, simply because of the way that they view the world is slightly different. And there's a whole issue that Andrew brought up about technology and how that, there are some kind of intergenerational differences that you can kind of harness and use. I think it is absolutely crucial, but I'd go even younger, asking adolescents what their view was on care homes. I mean, my children, I had to drag my children to see my grandmother probably 3-4 times a week because she was under my care. Well, they were toddlers. They had plenty to say about how the care home functioned, or why is she not allowed to do this, or why can't, and even now, I mean, now they're kind of young people, but they would still have some great ideas, and it is everybody's future, the future of our, the last few years on Earth. It's how should it look, and from kind of climate perspective, how should these buildings be heated? And these are all important questions. They're not just for one generation. They affect all of us at some point.
Maybe not taking that very long-term view towards things. I know until you'd asked, I hadn't particularly considered it myself. I think it's just innate to kind of the nature of humans. It's difficult to think that long-term ahead. Like, I haven't even properly thought about my pension, and we study social policy and talk about the importance of pensions all the time. So yeah, and I think as well, maybe on that it is that they're kind of out of sight. A lot of what we've talked about when we're talking about what we think about care homes comes from our own experiences of loved ones being in a care home. But other than that, how often do we actually come into contact with care homes? Well, personally, for me, not that often.
Yeah, I mean, I think to absolutely echo what Myri said about, long-term thinking, especially at a younger age, this sense of sort of vulnerability, invulnerability, and you're sort of not thinking that long term. And you're very shaped by your own loved ones and experiences, your grandparents' experiences, your parents, and whether or not you interact with these spaces or not. And I think, COVID's been illuminated in many degrees, but I think one aspect has just been how devastating it has been for older people in care homes, and really bringing to light the problems and deficiencies that existed. And I think not only were people's grandparents and people with underlying conditions more vulnerable throughout, but I think it also really made you reflect upon these spaces that we've really sort of emphasized as the place to have your grandparents move into, for different reasons, but that were also had so many problems that really made them particularly devastating when COVID came. Also sort of maybe has reinvigorated this conversation, maybe not in the deep way that we really need it to, and maybe younger folks are not still as engaged as they need to be in thinking they have a stake in this, both in caring for older people as a part of your society, but also for your own personal age and development as you potentially move into one when you get older. So I think on the flip side too, I think maybe the conversation has remained very siloed, of it only, being held amongst older generations for good reason, but thinking that, we don't need to engage younger people and hear their thoughts and think about how they're envisioning these things. So I think there's both sides of that equation, and I think there's a lot of space to sort of rectify that and bring more perspectives to really reimagine what care homes look like.